The rifle's barrel pressed cold against Carolyn Robinson's temple as her father's weathered hands trembled with rage. Behind him, the mountain man Zachary Woods stood frozen in the cabin doorway, snow swirling around his massive frame, like nature itself had come to witness this moment of reckoning. The bruises on Carolyn's face had faded to yellow and green, but the memory of her husband's fists remained as fresh as the day she'd fled up this mountain, seeking sanctuary. "You brought shame on our family," her father spat, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Coming up here to live in sin with this savage, instead of staying with your rightful husband. Timothy Morales paid good money for you, and by God, you'll honor that arrangement." Zachary's jaw tightened, his pale blue eyes never leaving the weapon aimed at the woman who had stumbled into his isolated world 3 months ago, broken and bleeding. The same woman who had slowly learned to trust again within these rough-hewn walls. The same woman who had taught him that his heart, which he'd thought frozen solid by years of solitude, could still beat with purpose. "She stays with me," Zachary said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down bears and blizzards without flinching. "Forever," the word hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Carolyn felt something shift deep in her chest. This was the moment everything would change, one way or another. But to understand how they had arrived at this precipice, we must go back to the beginning, to a time when hope seemed as distant as the stars barely visible through the mountain's endless storms. 3 months earlier, Carolyn Robinson had been a different woman entirely. Her maiden name felt like a relic from another life, buried beneath the weight of an arranged marriage that had transformed her from a spirited young woman into something fragile and fearful. Timothy Morales had seemed respectable enough when her father negotiated the union, a successful merchant with property in town and connections that would benefit their struggling family. What her father hadn't known, or perhaps hadn't cared to discover, was the darkness that lived behind Timothy's public facade. The first blow had come on their wedding night, delivered with such casual cruelty that Carolyn had wondered if she had somehow misunderstood the nature of marriage itself. The second came 3 days later, when she had dared to suggest they might attend church together. By the third week, she had learned to move through their house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, keeping her eyes downcast, measuring each breath to avoid triggering his unpredictable rage. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The mountain holds many secrets, and this story is just beginning to unfold. The bruises were easy enough to hide beneath long sleeves and high necklines, but the fear had burrowed deeper, settling into her bones like winter cold. Timothy was careful, she had to give him that. He never struck her face when they might have visitors, never left marks that would show during their rare public appearances. To the outside world, they were a respectable married couple, and Carolyn learned to play her part with the skill of a seasoned actress. But even the most carefully constructed performance has its limits. And Carolyn's came on a gray October morning when Timothy's latest business venture had failed spectacularly. She had been preparing breakfast when he stormed into the kitchen, his face twisted with the kind of rage she had learned to recognize as particularly dangerous. The coffee pot had been in her hand when he backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling against the stove. The hot liquid had splashed across her arms, adding burns to the collection of injuries she carried like shameful secrets. That was the morning she made her decision. While Timothy raged through the house, destroying furniture and cursing everyone from his business partners to the weather itself, Carolyn had slipped into their bedroom and gathered what few possessions she could carry. Her grandmother's wedding ring, hidden away since the day Timothy had replaced it with his own ostentatious choice. A small bag of coins she had been secretly saving from the household money. The warmest clothes she owned, and though none of them were designed for the kind of journey she was contemplating. The mountains had always called to her, even as a child. While other girls played with dolls and dreamed of marriage, Carolyn had gazed up at the towering peaks that surrounded their valley and wondered what lay beyond their snow-capped summits. Her father had dismissed such thoughts as foolish fancy, insisting that a woman's place was in the home, not wandering through the wilderness like some kind of wild creature. But now, with nowhere else to turn, those distant peaks seemed to offer the only hope of escape she could imagine. She had waited until Timothy passed out drunk in his study, then slipped from the house like a shadow fleeing the dawn. The mountain trail was treacherous even in good weather, but October brought its own particular challenges. The first snow had already fallen at the higher elevations, and the path grew increasingly difficult to follow as she climbed. Her thin boots were soaked through within the first hour, and her fingers had gone numb despite the threadbare gloves she wore. By the time the sun began to set, Carolyn realized she had made a terrible mistake. The trail had disappeared entirely, lost beneath a carpet of fallen leaves and early snow. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Every step sent sharp pains through her feet, and she suspected she was developing frostbite in her toes. The romantic notion of escaping to the mountains had given way to the harsh reality that she was going to die alone in the wilderness, and perhaps that was what she deserved for abandoning her marriage vows. It was full dark when she saw the light flickering through the trees ahead. At first, she thought it might be a hallucination brought on by cold and exhaustion, but as she stumbled toward it, the warm glow resolved into the windows of a small cabin nestled in a clearing. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the sight of it filled her with such desperate hope that she began to run, or what passed for running given her condition. She collapsed on the cabin's front porch, her strength finally giving out completely. Through the haze of approaching unconsciousness, she heard heavy footsteps approaching, saw the door swing open to reveal a massive silhouette backlit by firelight. Strong hands lifted her with surprising gentleness, and she felt herself being carried into warmth and safety. When she woke, she was lying on a narrow bed covered with thick furs, a fire crackling in the hearth nearby. Her wet clothes had been replaced with a clean, oversized shirt that smelled of pine and wood smoke. For a moment, panic gripped her as she wondered what kind of man she had encountered, what price he might demand for his assistance. But then she noticed that her boots had been carefully placed by the fire to dry, and a bowl of warm broth sat on the small table beside the bed, steam rising from its surface like an offering. The man himself sat in a chair across the room, whittling a piece of wood with practiced strokes. He was enormous, easily the largest human being Carolyn had ever seen, with shoulders that seemed to span half the width of the cabin. His hair was dark and unkempt, his beard full and wild, but his eyes, when they met hers, were surprisingly gentle. He looked like something from the old stories her grandmother used to tell, a mountain spirit made flesh. "You're awake," he said simply, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate through the wooden walls. "Thought you might not make it for a while there." Carolyn tried to speak, but found her throat too raw and dry to form words. The man noticed her difficulty and stood, moving with surprising grace for someone of his size. He ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup and brought it to her, supporting her head while she drank. The water was cold and sweet, tasting of mountain springs and clean snow. "Name's Zachary Wood," he said, settling back into his chair. "This is my place. Been living up here about 10 years now, give or take. Don't get many visitors, especially not ones half frozen and running from something." The last words carried a weight of understanding that made Carolyn's eyes fill with tears. She tried to sit up to explain herself, but Zachary held up a hand to stop her. "Rest first," he said. "Talk later if you want to. If you don't, that's fine too. Mountains got room for all kinds of secrets." Over the following days, as Carolyn recovered her strength, she began to understand the rhythm of Zachary's life. He rose before dawn to tend to his small herd of goats and check the snares he had set for rabbits and other small game. He spent his mornings chopping wood or making repairs to the cabin, his afternoons hunting or foraging for the supplies that would see him through the winter. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire carving intricate figures from pieces of driftwood or reading from one of the dozen books that comprised his entire library. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes about his character. He never asked about her past, never demanded explanations for her presence in his home. He simply accepted her as she was, offering food and shelter and the kind of quiet companionship she had never known existed. When she finally felt strong enough to tell him about Timothy, about the marriage that had become a prison, he listened without judgment, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight as she spoke. "Some men," he said when she had finished, "don't understand that strength isn't about how much pain you can cause. It's about how much you can endure and how much you can protect." It was a simple statement, but it carried more wisdom than all the sermons Carolyn had heard in church, more comfort than all the platitudes well-meaning friends had offered during her marriage. For the first time in months, she felt truly seen, truly understood. As October gave way to November, Carolyn found herself settling into the rhythms of mountain life. She learned to tend the fire properly, to prepare the wild game Zachary brought home, to mend clothes and blankets with neat, careful stitches. Her hands, which had grown soft and pale during her marriage, became strong and capable once again. The constant fear that had lived in her chest began to ease, replaced by something she had almost forgotten existed: peace. Zachary, for his part, seemed to bloom in her presence. The solitary mountain man began to share stories of his past, tales of his childhood in a mining town, his years working as a logger before he decided to leave civilization behind. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude, but Carolyn's arrival had reminded him that humans were meant to live in connection with one another, not in complete isolation. They developed their own language of small gestures and shared glances. Zachary would leave wildflowers on the table beside her morning coffee. Carolyn would mend his shirts with extra care, adding small decorative touches that transformed purely functional garments into something approaching art. They worked together in comfortable silence, two people who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were looking for. The first snow of winter arrived in late November, falling thick and heavy until the world outside the cabin was transformed into a pristine white wilderness. Carolyn stood at the window watching the flakes dance and swirl and realized that she was not afraid. The snow that would have terrified her 3 months ago now felt like protection, a barrier between her old life and this new existence she was building. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Zachary said, coming to stand beside her at the window. "Yes," she replied, but she wasn't looking at the snow anymore. She was looking at his reflection in the glass, at the way the firelight played across his weathered features, at the gentleness that lived behind his mountain man exterior. That night, as they sat by the fire, Carolyn made a decision that would have seemed impossible during her marriage. She reached across the small space that separated their chairs and took Zachary's hand in hers. His fingers were calloused and scarred from years of hard work, but they closed around hers with infinite tenderness. "I want to stay," she said simply, "if you'll have me." Zachary's answer came not in words, but in the way he lifted their joined hands and pressed them against his heart. In that gesture, Carolyn felt the last of her old fears dissolve. She was no longer the broken woman who had fled into the mountains. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone worthy of love. The winter passed in a haze of quiet contentment. They read to each other by firelight, shared meals that tasted better than any feast Carolyn had known in her former life, and slowly, carefully, built something that neither of them had dared to hope for: love, real and honest and free from the shadows that had darkened Carolyn's marriage. But even in the most perfect sanctuary, the outside world has a way of intruding. The first sign of trouble came in early March, when Zachary returned from checking his traps with news that tracks had been spotted lower on the mountain. Human tracks and fresh ones. "Could be anyone took them," he said, but Carolyn could see the worry in his eyes. Trappers, maybe, or someone looking for a lost animal. But they both knew it was more likely that someone had come looking for her. Timothy was not the kind of man to let his property simply walk away, and her father would view her abandonment of her marriage as a stain on the family honor that demanded correction. The tracks appeared again the next day, closer to the cabin this time. Zachary began carrying his rifle when he went outside, and Carolyn found herself jumping at every sound, every creak of the cabin's wooden frame. The peace they had built together felt suddenly fragile, as if it might shatter at the slightest touch. On the third day, the visitors made themselves known. Carolyn was preparing lunch when she heard voices outside, rough and demanding. Through the window, she could see 3 men on horseback, their faces hard and unfriendly. She recognized one of them immediately: her brother-in-law, Justin Lopez, Timothy's younger brother and frequent partner in his business ventures. Zachary appeared in the doorway, his rifle held casually but ready. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "We're looking for a woman," Justin called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Carolyn Morales. Her husband sent us to bring her home." "Don't know anyone by that name," Zachary replied evenly. Justin's laugh was harsh and mocking, Mountain Man, we know she's here. We followed her tracks right to your door. Now you can hand her over peaceful-like, or we can take her by force. Either way, she's coming with us. Carolyn felt her newly found strength wavering as the old fears rushed back. These men represented everything she had fled from, the world that had tried to break her spirit and nearly succeeded. But then she felt Zachary's presence beside her, solid and reassuring, and she remembered who she had become during these months in the mountains. I'm not going anywhere, she said, stepping out onto the porch despite Zachary's protective gesture. And my name is Carolyn Robinson, not Morales. I never took that man's name, and I never will. Justin's face darkened with anger. You're a married woman and you'll do as your husband commands. Timothy's been patient, but his patience has limits. You've embarrassed him long enough. Timothy forfeited any claim to patience when he raised his hand to me, Carolyn replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. I owe him nothing. You owe him obedience, one of the other men snarled. It's in the Bible, woman. A wife submits to her husband in all things. Zachary's grip tightened on his rifle. I think you gentlemen have said enough. The lady has made her position clear. Time for you to move along. Justin's hand moved toward the pistol on his hip. This isn't your concern, Mountain Man. This is family business. She's under my protection, Zachary said, and there was something in his voice that made all three men shift uneasily in their saddles. That makes it my business. For a moment, the tableau held. Three armed men on horseback facing down one mountain man and a woman who refused to be cowed. The wind whistled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as if sensing the tension that crackled through the clearing. Then Justin made his choice. His hand closed around his pistol grip, and Zachary's rifle came up with fluid precision. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the mountainsides, followed immediately by Justin's scream of pain as the bullet shattered his wrist. His weapon fell to the snow, useless. Next one goes center mass, Zachary said calmly, working the bolt action to chamber another round. Your choice. The other two men looked at their wounded leader, then at the unwavering barrel of Zachary's rifle, and made the sensible decision. They helped Justin onto his horse and retreated down the mountain, but not before Justin called back a final threat. This isn't over. Timothy will come himself next time, and he'll bring the law with him. You can't hide up here forever. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Carolyn felt herself begin to shake. Not from fear this time, but from the adrenaline of standing up for herself, of choosing her own path despite the consequences. Zachary set his rifle aside and gathered her into his arms, and she realized that she was crying. I'm sorry, she whispered against his chest. I've brought trouble to your door. Our door, he corrected gently, and trouble's just another word for life, trying to test how much we want something. How much do you want this, Carolyn? How much do you want us? She pulled back to look into his eyes, those pale blue depths that had become her anchor in every storm. More than anything, more than safety, more than approval, more than the life I was supposed to want. I want this. I want you. I want the woman I become when I'm with you. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Then we'll face whatever comes together. Mountains taught me that the strongest trees are the ones that bend in the wind but never break. We'll bend if we have to, but we won't break. The next few weeks passed in relative quiet, but they both knew it was the calm before a much larger storm. Zachary began teaching Carolyn to shoot, and she proved to be a natural marksman with both rifle and pistol. They stockpiled supplies and ammunition, turning the cabin into a fortress that could withstand a siege if necessary. Most importantly, they talked through every possible scenario, every choice they might have to make. If it comes down to it, Zachary said one evening as they cleaned their weapons by firelight, I'll take you deeper into the mountains. There are places up there where no one could find us, caves and hidden valleys that most folks don't even know exist. Carolyn nodded, but part of her rebelled against the idea of running again. She had spent too much of her life being afraid, too many years letting other people's expectations and demands shape her choices. The woman she had become in these mountains was not someone who ran from a fight, especially not when the stakes were this high. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived with a spring thaw, and Carolyn was tending the goats when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the cabin. Through the trees, she could see a larger group this time. Timothy himself, recognizable even at a distance by his expensive clothes and arrogant bearing, along with at least 6 other men. Some wore badges that caught the morning sunlight, marking them as law enforcement officers. She ran back to the cabin, where Zachary was already preparing for battle. His rifle lay loaded and ready on the table, along with 2 pistols and enough ammunition to fight a small war. But as Carolyn looked at the approaching force, she realized that firepower alone would not be enough this time. "There are too many of them," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "They'll overwhelm us." Zachary nodded grimly. "Maybe. But they'll pay a price for it." The riders drew up in front of the cabin, and Timothy dismounted with the theatrical flourish that Carolyn remembered all too well. He was a handsome man in the conventional sense, with dark hair and regular features, but his eyes held a coldness that had always made her skin crawl. Behind him, the deputy sheriffs arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, hands resting on their weapons. "Carolyn," Timothy called out, his voice carrying the false warmth he used when trying to manipulate someone. "Enough of this foolishness. It's time to come home." She stepped out onto the porch, Zachary beside her, and felt a surge of satisfaction at the way Timothy's confident expression faltered slightly when he saw how she had changed. Gone was the timid, broken woman he had married. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who would not be easily cowed. "This is my home," she said clearly. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Timothy's mask of false concern slipped, revealing the anger beneath. "You're my wife, legally and in the eyes of God. These men are here to ensure that you fulfill your obligations." One of the deputies, a thin man with nervous eyes, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Alan Young. Your husband has sworn out a warrant for your arrest on charges of abandonment and adultery. You need to come with us." Carolyn felt her heart sink. She had known this moment might come, but the reality of it was still devastating. The law was on Timothy's side, as it always was when it came to matters between husband and wife. A woman's word meant little against a man's, especially when that man had money and influence. "Adultery?" she said, her voice sharp with indignation. "I've committed no adultery." Timothy's smile was cruel and knowing. "You've been living in sin with this mountain savage for months. What else would you call it?" "I call it finding sanctuary from a man who used his fist to make his points," Carolyn replied. "I call it discovering what it means to be treated with respect and kindness." "Pretty words," Timothy said dismissively. "But the law is the law. You're coming home, and that's final." Zachary stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the smaller man. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Deputy Young's hand moved to his pistol. "Sir, I don't want any trouble, but we have legal authority here. Interfering with the execution of a warrant is a felony." "So is assault," Zachary replied evenly. "And I've got witnesses to this man's treatment of his wife." Timothy laughed harshly. "Witnesses? Who's going to believe the word of a hermit and a runaway wife against a respected businessman and sworn officers of the law?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Carolyn realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for without knowing it. All those months of healing, of growing stronger, of learning to trust herself again, had led to this single point in time where she would have to choose between safety and truth, between compliance and courage. "I'll testify," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I'll tell anyone who will listen about what you did to me, Timothy, about the bruises you gave me, the fear you planted in my heart, the way you tried to break my spirit." Timothy's face flushed with rage. "You'll say nothing, because you'll be locked in your room until you learn to behave like a proper wife." "No," Carolyn said simply, "I won't." The words seemed to echo in the mountain air, carrying with it all the weight of her transformation. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled into the wilderness. She was someone who had found her voice, her strength, her worth. Timothy's composure finally cracked completely. "You ungrateful bitch, I gave you everything. A home, security, respectability, and this is how you repay me? By running off to play house with some wild man in the mountains?" "You gave me nothing but pain," Carolyn replied. "Zachary gave me back my life." Timothy's hand moved toward his weapon, but Zachary was faster. The mountain man's rifle came up in one smooth motion, its barrel centering on Timothy's chest. Around them, the deputies drew their own weapons, creating a deadly standoff in the peaceful mountain clearing. "Easy now," Deputy Young said nervously. "Let's all just calm down and handle this legal-like." But Timothy was beyond reason now, his face twisted with the kind of rage Carolyn remembered from their worst nights together. "I paid good money for you," he snarled. "You're mine, bought and paid for, and I'll be damned if I let some mountain savage steal my property." The word property seemed to hang in the air like a curse, and Carolyn felt something inside her snap. All the fear, all the shame, all the years of being treated as less than human crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "I am not property," she said, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "I am not something to be bought or sold or owned. I am a human being with the right to choose my own path, my own happiness, my own future." Timothy raised his pistol, his face contorted with murderous intent. "You're nothing but a whore who needs to be taught her place." The shot rang out across the mountainside, but it wasn't Timothy's weapon that fired. Zachary's rifle spoke with deadly authority, and Timothy crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. The deputy's weapon swung toward Zachary, but he had already worked the bolt action, ready for whatever came next. "Self-defense," he said calmly. Man was about to shoot an unarmed woman. Deputy Young looked at the wounded Timothy, then at Zachary's unwavering rifle, then at Carolyn's determined face. The calculation was visible in his eyes as he weighed the legal complexities of the situation against the very real possibility of more bloodshed. "This is getting out of hand," he said finally. "Maybe we should all take a step back and think about this." But Timothy, even wounded, was not finished. "Arrest them both!" he screamed, struggling to his feet with one hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. "They're criminals, outlaws. I want them hanged." It was then that Carolyn's father arrived, his horse thundering into the clearing with several more men behind him. Gregory Jackson was a hard man, weathered by years of frontier life, and his face was set in lines of grim determination. He took in the scene at a glance, his daughter standing defiant on the cabin porch, the wounded Timothy raging in the snow, the nervous deputies caught between duty and discretion. "Carolyn," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a patriarch accustomed to obedience, "you will come home immediately and make amends to your husband." "No, father," she replied, and the simple word carried the weight of a revolution. "I won't." Gregory's face darkened with anger. "You have disgraced our family name. You have broken sacred vows. You will do your duty as a wife and daughter, or you are no daughter of mine." The threat that would have devastated her months ago now seemed almost pitiful. Carolyn looked at the man who had raised her, who had taught her to read and ride and shoot, who had also sold her to the highest bidder without regard for her happiness or safety. "Then I am no daughter of yours," she said quietly, "because I will never again allow anyone to treat me as less than I am worth." The words hung in the mountain air like a final judgment, and Carolyn felt a strange sense of liberation wash over her. She had just severed the last chain that bound her to her old life, and while it hurt more than she had expected, it also felt like stepping out of a prison cell into sunlight. Gregory's face went white with shock and rage. In all his years of raising children, none had ever dared to defy him so completely. His hand moved to the rifle slung across his saddle, and suddenly the clearing was full of the metallic clicks of weapons being cocked and aimed. "Seems like we have ourselves a genuine standoff," Deputy Young observed nervously. "Maybe we should all just—" "She's my daughter," Gregory roared, cutting off the deputy's attempt at diplomacy. "I have the right to bring her home." "She's a grown woman," Zachary replied, his rifle never wavering from its target. "She has the right to choose her own path." Timothy, still bleeding and furious, staggered forward. "Rights? She has no rights. She's a woman, and a married woman at that. Her place is in my house, in my bed, bearing my children and keeping my home." The raw hatred in his voice made several of the deputies shift uncomfortably. Even in an age when women had few legal protections, Timothy's words carried an ugliness that decent men found distasteful. "Sir," Deputy Young said carefully, "maybe we should get you to a doctor for that wound." I don't need a doctor, Timothy snarled. I need my wife back where she belongs. He raised his pistol again, this time aiming directly at Zachary. I'll kill the bastard who stole her from me. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. Zachary's finger tightened on his trigger as Timothy's weapon swung toward him. Gregory spurred his horse forward, shouting something that was lost in the chaos. The deputies, caught between conflicting loyalties and legal uncertainties, hesitated at the crucial moment. And Carolyn, seeing the man she loved about to be murdered by the man who had tormented her, made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She threw herself between Zachary and Timothy's pistol, just as both men fired. The world exploded into noise and smoke and pain. Carolyn felt the bullet tear through her side, spinning her around and sending her crashing into Zachary's arms. Through the haze of agony, she heard Timothy scream as Zachary's shot found its mark, heard the shouts and curses of the men around them, felt Zachary's strong hands pressing against her wound to stop the bleeding. Carolyn! Zachary's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she could feel his breath against her ear. Stay with me, darling. Stay with me. She tried to speak, to tell him that she was all right, that it would take more than one bullet to stop her now, but the words wouldn't come, and darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was her father's face, twisted with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she woke, she was lying in the cabin's bed, her side wrapped in clean bandages that smelled of the mountain herbs Zachary used for healing. Sunlight streamed through the windows, suggesting that she had been unconscious for hours, possibly days. The first thing she became aware of was the absence of pain, or at least the reduction of it to a manageable level. The second was the sound of voices outside, low and serious. She struggled to sit up, gasping as the movement sent fire through her wounded side. But she was determined to know what was happening, what decisions were being made about her future while she lay helpless. With careful, painful movements, she made her way to the window and peered outside. The scene in the clearing had changed dramatically. Timothy lay motionless in the snow, a dark stain spreading beneath him. Several of the deputies were digging what was obviously a grave, while others stood guard. Her father sat his horse apart from the group, his face a mask of grief and rage. And Zachary stood in the center of it all, his hands bound behind his back, surrounded by men with drawn weapons. The sight sent a surge of adrenaline through Carolyn that overcame her physical weakness. They were going to arrest Zachary, possibly hang him, for defending her. The man who had saved her life, who had given her back her sense of worth and dignity, was about to pay the ultimate price for loving her. She stumbled toward the door, ignoring the agony in her side. Whatever it cost her, whatever the consequences, she would not let Zachary suffer for her choices. She had found her voice in these mountains, had learned to stand up for herself and those she loved. Now was the time to use that strength. The door swung open with a bang that made everyone in the clearing turn toward her. Carolyn stood near the doorway, one hand pressed against her bandaged side, the other gripping the door frame for support. She was pale and obviously in pain, but her eyes blazed with determination. "Let him go," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing despite her weakness. Deputy Young stepped forward, his face creased with concern. "Ma'am, you should be resting. You've lost a lot of blood." "I've lost a lot of things," Carolyn replied, "but I won't lose him. Not for defending me against a man who was trying to murder us both." Her father urged his horse closer, his expression unreadable. "Carolyn, Timothy is dead. Your husband is dead. Killed by this mountain man you've been living with in sin. Timothy stopped being my husband the first time he raised his hand to me," Carolyn said firmly. "And Zachary killed him to save both our lives. Any court in the territory would call it justifiable homicide." "Would they?" Gregory's voice was bitter. "Would they really take the word of a runaway wife and her lover against the testimony of sworn officers and respectable citizens?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Carolyn realized that her father was right. The legal system was not designed to protect women like her, especially when they chose to defy social conventions. Zachary could very well hang for defending her, and there would be little she could do to prevent it. But then Deputy Young surprised everyone by speaking up. Actually, sir, I saw the whole thing. Timothy Morales drew first and was aiming to kill. Mr. Wood here was defending himself and the lady. It's the lady. That's clear-cut self-defense in my book. One of the other deputies nodded agreement. Timothy was acting like a madman, threatening to kill them both. Can't say I blame the mountain man for protecting his woman. Gregory's face flushed with anger. His woman? She's a married woman. Was a married woman, he corrected himself. She has obligations, responsibilities. She has the right to live without being beaten, Deputy Young replied quietly. I've got eyes, Mr. Jackson. I can see the old bruises on her arms, the way she flinches when men raise their voices. Whatever obligations she had to Timothy Morales, he broke them first when he started using his fists on her. The admission hung in the mountain air like a revelation. Here was a lawman, a representative of the system that was supposed to uphold traditional values and male authority, acknowledging that a woman had the right to defend herself against an abusive husband. It was more than Carolyn had dared to hope for. But Gregory was not finished fighting. You're talking about destroying the very foundation of civilized society, he said, his voice rising with passion. If wives can simply walk away from their marriages whenever they please, what becomes of family? What becomes of order and stability? What becomes of human decency, Carolyn asked, stepping fully out onto the porch despite the pain it caused her. What becomes of love and respect and treating people as more than property to be owned and controlled? She looked around at the assembled men, these representatives of the world she had fled. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot as they avoided her gaze. Others seemed genuinely thoughtful, as if they were considering ideas that had never occurred to them before. A few, like her father, remained stubbornly convinced that she was wrong. I know what you all think of me, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. A disobedient daughter, a faithless wife, a woman who has forgotten her place and abandoned her duties. But let me tell you what I think of myself. She paused, gathering her strength and her thoughts, knowing that this might be her only chance to speak her truth. I think I am a human being with the same right to happiness and safety as any man in this clearing. I think I am someone who deserves to be loved, not beaten, respected, not owned, cherished, not controlled. I think I am a woman who has finally learned her own worth, and I will not apologize for that knowledge. The silence that followed her words was profound. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the mountain itself was listening to her declaration of independence. Finally, Deputy Young cleared his throat. Well, he said quietly, I reckon that's about the most honest thing I've heard in a long time. He turned to the other deputies, his expression thoughtful. Boys, I'm thinking we might have been looking at this situation all wrong. We came up here to arrest a runaway wife. But what we found was a woman who was defending herself against a man who was trying to kill her. Seems to me like she's the victim here, not the criminal. You can't be serious, Gregory protested. She abandoned her marriage vows. She's been living in adultery with this savage. Has she? Deputy Young asked mildly. Or has she been living under the protection of a man who treated her with more kindness and respect than her legal husband ever did? He walked over to where Zachary stood bound, and after a moment's consideration began untying the ropes. Mr. Wood, I apologize for the restraints. After witnessing what happened here today, I'm satisfied that you acted in lawful defense of yourself and the lady. Zachary rubbed his wrists where the ropes had chafed, his eyes never leaving Carolyn's face. Thank you, Deputy. But what happens now? It was a good question, and one that hung over the clearing like a storm cloud. Timothy was dead, which solved one problem, but created others. Carolyn was technically a widow now, free from the legal bonds of marriage. But she was also a woman who had defied social conventions in a way that would make her an outcast in polite society. Now, Deputy Young said slowly, I think we all go back to town and forget that any of this ever happened. Timothy Morales died in a hunting accident. Tragic. But these things happen in the wilderness. As for Mrs. Morales, well, she's a widow now, free to make her own choices about her future. You can't cover this up, Gregory said desperately. There are too many witnesses, too many people who know the truth. The truth, Deputy Young replied, is that a woman was being threatened by a violent man, and another man defended her. Everything else is just gossip and speculation. He turned to address the other deputies. Any of you boys see anything different than what I just described? One by one, the lawmen shook their heads. They had seen enough of Timothy's behavior to know that justice had been served, even if it hadn't come through official channels. Sometimes the law and justice were two different things, and today justice had won. But Gregory Jackson was not a man to give up easily. He dismounted from his horse and strode toward the cabin, his face set in lines of grim determination. Carolyn, this foolishness ends now. You're coming home with me, and we'll figure out how to salvage what's left of your reputation. No, Father, Carolyn said quietly. I'm not. You're my daughter. I was your daughter, she corrected. But you forfeited that relationship when you sold me to a man who beat me, when you cared more about money and social standing than my happiness and safety. Gregory's hand moved toward his rifle, and suddenly the clearing was tense with the possibility of more violence. But before he could draw the weapon, Zachary stepped between him and Carolyn, his massive frame blocking the older man's path. Mr. Jackson, Zachary said quietly, your daughter has made her choice. She's chosen to stay here, with me, of her own free will. You can respect that choice, or you can leave, but you will not threaten her. Gregory's eyes blazed with fury. You think you can steal my daughter and face no consequences? You think you can destroy everything I have worked to build and walk away unpunished? I think, Zachary replied evenly, that your daughter is not property to be stolen. She's a human being who deserves to be happy. And if that happiness lies with me in these mountains, then that's where she belongs. The confrontation between the two men crackled with tension, and Carolyn realized that despite everything that had happened, despite Timothy's death and the deputy's support, her future still hung in the balance. Her father was not a man to accept defeat gracefully, and she could see in his eyes that he was prepared to use violence to enforce what he saw as his paternal rights. But then something unexpected happened. One of the men who had ridden with her father, a neighbor named Alan Young, who had known her since childhood, stepped forward. Gregory, he said quietly, maybe it's time to let her go. Gregory whirled on him, his face flushed with anger. Et tu, Alan, you too would see family bonds destroyed, marriage vows made meaningless? Alan shook his head sadly. I'd see a young woman who's suffered enough finally find some peace. I remember Carolyn as a child, Gregory. She was bright and spirited and full of life. When I saw her at her wedding, that light was already dimming. And every time I saw her after that, she seemed smaller, more frightened, more broken. He gestured toward where she stood on the cabin porch, supported by Zachary's gentle strength. Look at her now. Really look at her. When's the last time you saw her stand so straight, speak so clearly, show such courage? This mountain man hasn't stolen your daughter, Gregory. He's helped her find herself again. The words hit Gregory like physical blows, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, his certainty seemed to waver. He looked at Carolyn, really looked at her, and perhaps saw what Alan had observed. The frightened, broken woman who had fled into the mountains had been replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more alive. She's still my daughter, he said, but the words lacked their earlier conviction. Yes, Alan agreed. She is. And as her father, shouldn't you want her to be happy? Shouldn't you want her to be with someone who treats her with love and respect instead of violence and cruelty? Gregory's shoulders sagged as the fight seemed to go out of him. He was a proud man, accustomed to having his way, but he was also not entirely without love for his children. Seeing Carolyn as she truly was now, seeing the strength and dignity she had reclaimed, forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about the choices he had made on her behalf. The marriage contract, he said weakly. The bride price Timothy paid. The family honor. The contract died with Timothy, Deputy Young pointed out. As for the bride price, well, seems to me that was payment for a service Timothy never properly provided. A husband's supposed to protect and cherish his wife, not beat her. He broke his end of the bargain first. Gregory looked around the clearing at the faces of the men who had ridden with him, searching for support that was no longer there. They had all seen enough of Timothy's true nature to understand that Carolyn had been the victim, not the villain. In this tragedy, finally, his gaze settled on his daughter once more. She stood tall and proud despite her injury, her hand resting trustingly on Zachary's arm. There was no fear in her eyes now, no desperate pleading for approval or forgiveness. She had made her choice and was prepared to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. "Carolyn," Gregory said, his voice heavy with resignation and something that might have been regret, "are you certain this is what you want? Life in these mountains will be hard. You'll be cut off from civilization, from family, from everything you've known." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Carolyn replied. "I've found something here that I never had before. The freedom to be myself, to make my own choices, to live without fear, to love and be loved in return. That's worth more to me than all the civilization and respectability in the world." Gregory nodded slowly, the last of his resistance crumbling. "Then I suppose there's nothing more to say." He turned to Zachary, his expression stern, but no longer hostile. "You take care of her, mountain man. She's more precious than you know." "I know exactly how precious she is," Zachary replied, "and I'll spend every day of my life proving myself worthy of her trust." Gregory mounted his horse with the careful movements of a man who had suddenly aged years in the span of minutes. He looked down at his daughter one last time, and Carolyn thought she saw tears in his eyes. "I love you, Carolyn," he said quietly. "I always have, even when I made poor choices about your future. I hope someday you can forgive an old fool who thought he knew what was best for his daughter." "I love you too, Father," Carolyn replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "And there's nothing to forgive. You did what you thought was right with the knowledge you had at the time." It wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it, but it was a kindness that allowed them both to part with some measure of dignity and tact. Gregory touched his hat brim in a gesture of farewell, then turned his horse toward the trail that led down the mountain. The other men followed, some nodding respectfully to Carolyn and Zachary, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Within minutes, the clearing was empty except for the two of them and the churned snow that marked where so many horses and men had stood. Deputy Young was the last to leave, pausing to speak privately with Zachary while Carolyn rested against the cabin's doorframe. "You know this isn't really over," the deputy said quietly. "There'll be talk in town, speculation about what really happened up here. Some folks won't be satisfied with the hunting accident story." Zachary nodded. "I figured as much. But Carolyn's free now, legally and otherwise. That's what matters." "She's free," Deputy Young agreed, "but freedom comes with a price. You both know that life will be harder now, more isolated. Some doors that were open before will be closed to her forever." "Then we'll make our own doors," Zachary replied. "Build our own life up here where nobody can touch it." Deputy Young smiled and extended his hand. "I wish you both the best, truly. What you did today, standing up for what's right despite the that took real courage, Waitress." After the deputy rode away, Carolyn and Zachary stood together in the sudden quiet of the clearing. The snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes that would soon cover the evidence of the day's violence. In a few hours, it would look like nothing had ever happened here, like the clearing had always been peaceful and undisturbed. "Are you all right?" Zachary asked, his arm tightening around her waist as he felt her sway slightly. "I'm perfect," Carolyn replied in Vendivad. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong, with exactly the right person." They made their way back into the cabin, where the fire still crackled warmly in the hearth. Zachary helped Carolyn back to bed, checking her bandages with the careful attention of someone who had learned field medicine through necessity. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing vital organs, but she had lost a significant amount of blood and would need time to recover fully. "You scared me," he admitted as he adjusted her pillows. "When I saw you throw yourself between me and Timothy's gun, I thought my heart would stop." "I couldn't let him hurt you," Carolyn said simply. "Not when you've given me so much." "I've given you nothing but a rough cabin and simple food," Zachary protested. "You could have had so much more in town, with a different kind of man." Carolyn reached up to cup his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palms. "You gave me back my life, Zachary. You gave me safety and respect and love. You showed me that I was worth more than I had ever imagined. That's not nothing. That's everything. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. I love you, Carolyn Robinson. I loved you from the moment you stood up to those men who came looking for you, when you showed them the strength that had been inside you all along. And I love you, she replied, not just for protecting me, but for seeing who I really was underneath all the fear and pain, for giving me space to heal and grow and become myself again. They held each other in the firelight, two people who had found in each other exactly what they had never dared to hope for. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary. But inside the cabin, warmth and love, and the promise of a future built on mutual respect and genuine affection, filled every corner. As the days passed and Carolyn's strength returned, they began to plan their life together. There would be challenges, they both knew that. The isolation would be difficult at times, and they would always have to be wary of those who might not accept their unconventional relationship. But they would face those challenges together, as partners in every sense of the word. I want to marry you, Zachary said one evening as they sat by the fire, Carolyn's head resting on his shoulder. Properly, legally, so that no one can ever question your right to be here. There's no preacher within 100 miles, Carolyn pointed out practically. Then we'll make our own vows, Zachary replied. Here, in front of this fire, with the mountain as our witness. We'll promise to love and honor and protect each other for as long as we both shall live. It was not a ceremony that would be recognized by law or church, but it was real in all the ways that mattered. They spoke their promises to each other in the flickering firelight, sealing their union with kisses and tears and the absolute certainty that they had found their home in each other. Spring came early that year, bringing with it the return of life to the mountain. Wildflowers bloomed in hidden meadows, streams ran clear and cold with snowmelt, and the world seemed full of possibilities. Carolyn threw herself into the work of making the cabin truly theirs, adding touches of beauty and comfort that transformed the rough shelter into a real home. She planted a garden in the clearing where Timothy had died, turning the site of violence into something productive and life-giving. The irony was not lost on either of them, but it seemed fitting somehow. From the ashes of her old life, something new and beautiful was growing. They received occasional visitors that first summer, trappers and hunters who had heard rumors about the woman living in the mountains with the hermit. Most were simply curious, but a few came with darker intentions. Men who thought a woman living outside society's protection was fair game for any kind of treatment. They learned quickly that Carolyn Robinson was not a victim waiting to be rescued or abused. She had learned to shoot with deadly accuracy, and more importantly, she had learned to defend herself with words as sharp as any blade. More than one would-be predator left the mountain with his pride in tatters and a new understanding of what it meant to underestimate a woman who had found her strength. But for every troublemaker, there were 2 or 3 decent men who came to respect what Carolyn and Zachary had built together. Word spread through the territory of the mountain woman who could outshoot most men and the gentle giant who had helped her find her courage. They became something of a legend, a story told around campfires and in taverns, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with disapproval, but always with a grudging respect for their determination to live life on their own terms. As autumn approached, bringing with it the first anniversary of Carolyn's arrival on the mountain, they received an unexpected visitor. Deputy Young rode into their clearing one crisp October morning, his horse steaming in the cool air. "Deputy," Zachary greeted him cautiously, "what brings you back up here?" "Good news, actually," the lawman replied, dismounting and accepting the cup of coffee Carolyn offered. "I thought you'd like to know that the territorial governor has officially pardoned you for Timothy Morales' death. Self-defense, just like we said. Your record is clean." It was news they had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. With the pardon, Zachary was free to travel to town if needed, free from the fear of arrest that had kept him isolated on the mountain for so long. "There's more," Deputy Young continued. "The territorial legislature is considering a new law that would make it easier for women to divorce abusive husbands. Some folks are calling it the Carolyn Robinson Act, though I don't suppose it'll keep that name officially." Carolyn felt tears spring to her eyes. The idea that her story might help other women escape situations like the one she had endured was almost too wonderful to believe. "How?" she asked. "How did this happen?" Your story got around, the deputy explained. Folks started talking about what you went through, what you did to escape it. Some of the territory's leading ladies took up your cause, said it was time women had more legal protections. It's slow going, but change is coming. The news filled Carolyn with a sense of purpose she hadn't expected. She had thought her story was over, that she had found her happy ending in the mountains with Zachary. But perhaps there was more work to be done, more women to help, more battles to fight. I want to testify, she said suddenly. When the legislature considers the law, I want to tell them what it's like to be trapped in a marriage with no way out. I want to help other women avoid what I went through. Zachary squeezed her hand supportively. It won't be easy. You'll face questions, criticism, people who think you should have stayed silent. Let them come, Carolyn replied with the fierce confidence she had learned in the mountains. I'm not afraid anymore. If my voice can help even one woman find the courage to save herself, then every word will be worth it. Deputy Young smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The legislative committee would like to meet with you next month, if you're willing to make the trip to the territorial capital. It would be Carolyn's first time leaving the mountain since her arrival over a year ago. The thought was both exciting and terrifying, but she knew it was something she had to do. She had found her voice in these mountains, and now it was time to use it to help others find theirs. The journey to the capital was long and difficult, but Zachary never left her side. They traveled together, two people who had learned that love was not about possession or control, but about supporting each other's growth and dreams. When Carolyn stood before the legislative committee and told her story, Zachary was there in the gallery, his presence giving her strength. Her testimony was powerful and moving, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had lived through hell and emerged stronger on the other side. She spoke of the fear that had ruled her life, the isolation that had made escape seem impossible, the moment when she had finally found the courage to choose herself over social expectations. The law that eventually passed was not everything advocates had hoped for, but it was a beginning. It made it easier for women to seek legal separation from abusive husbands, provided some protections for their property and children, and most importantly, established the principle that marriage was not a license for violence. Carolyn and Zachary returned to their mountain home as heroes to some and pariahs to others, but they had never cared much about public opinion, and they cared even less now. They had work to do, a life to build, a love to nurture. Over the years that followed, their cabin became a refuge for women fleeing dangerous situations. Word spread through underground networks that there was a place in the mountains where a woman could find safety and support, where she could heal and plan her next steps. Carolyn and Zachary never turned anyone away, no matter how dangerous it might be to harbor them. Some stayed only long enough to recover their strength before moving on to new lives in distant territories. Others, like Carolyn herself, found in the mountains a permanent home and a new sense of self. The cabin expanded over time, becoming a small compound of buildings that could house multiple families when needed. They never had children of their own, but they raised dozens of young women who came to them broken and left whole. They taught them to shoot and hunt and survive in the wilderness. But more importantly, they taught them to value themselves, to trust their own judgment, to never accept less than they deserved. The mountain that had once been Zachary's lonely refuge became a beacon of hope for women throughout the territory. And at the center of it all were two people who had found in each other not just love, but purpose. As they aged, their legend grew. Stories were told of the mountain woman who could outshoot any man and the gentle giant who had taught her to love again. Ballads were sung in taverns, books were written by Eastern authors who had never set foot west of the Mississippi, and politicians invoked their names when arguing for women's rights. But the real story was much simpler than the legend suggested. It was the story of two people who had found each other when they needed it most, who had chosen love over fear, courage over comfort, truth over convention. It was the story of a woman who had learned that she was worth more than she had ever imagined, and a man who had discovered that his greatest strength lay not in his ability to survive alone, but in his capacity to help others thrive. On winter evenings when the snow fell thick and the wind howled around their cabin, Carolyn and Zachary would sit by the fire and remember that first night when she had stumbled into his life, half frozen and completely broken. They would marvel at the journey that had brought them to this place, at the love that had grown from the seeds of desperation and hope. "Do you ever regret it?" Zachary would sometimes ask, "giving up the life you were supposed to have?" And Carolyn would always give the same answer: "I didn't give up a life. I found one." The final confrontation that had brought them to this point seemed like ancient history now, but its lessons remained fresh. They had learned that love was not about possession, but about freedom. Not about control, but about support. Not about changing someone, but about accepting them as they were while encouraging them to become who they were meant to be. Years passed, and their hair turned gray, then white. Their hands became gnarled with arthritis, and their steps grew slower on the mountain paths they had once navigated with ease. But their love never diminished, never grew stale or routine. If anything, it deepened with time, seasoned by shared struggles and sweetened by mutual respect. The women they had helped spread across the territory and beyond, carrying with them the lessons they had learned in the mountains. Many went on to become leaders in their communities, advocates for other women, voices for change in a world that was slowly, grudgingly beginning to acknowledge that women were more than property to be owned and controlled. The law that had become known as the Carolyn Robinson Act was eventually strengthened and expanded, providing more protections for women and children. Other territories adopted similar legislation, and when statehood came, these protections were written into the new Constitution. It was a legacy that neither Carolyn nor Zachary had expected when they first fell in love in a rough mountain cabin, but it was one they cherished. As the new century dawned, bringing with it changes they could never have imagined, Carolyn and Zachary remained in their mountain sanctuary. The world below grew more complex, more connected, more modern, but the simple truths they had discovered remained constant: that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, that love should lift up rather than tear down, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Their story became part of the folklore of the American West, told and retold around campfires and in parlors, adapted for stage and screen, romanticized and mythologized until the real people were almost lost beneath the legends. But for those who had known them personally, who had found refuge in their mountain home, who had learned from their example what it meant to live with integrity and purpose, the truth was far more powerful than any myth. Carolyn Robinson had entered the mountains as a broken woman fleeing an impossible situation. She had found there not just safety, but transformation. She had discovered her own worth, her own voice, her own power. And she had used these gifts not just to save herself, but to help countless others do the same. Zachary Wood had lived in solitude for years before Carolyn's arrival, convinced that he was meant to face the world alone. But her presence had shown him that true strength lay not in isolation, but in connection, not in independence, but in interdependence. Together they had built something greater than either could have achieved alone. Their love story was not the fairy tale romance of popular fiction, with its emphasis on passion and drama and happily ever after endings that required no further effort. It was something rarer and more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the daily choice to honor and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When Carolyn finally passed away, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, Zachary was holding her hand. Her last words were a whisper of gratitude for the life they had built together, for the love that had sustained them through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. Zachary followed her 6 months later, unable to imagine a world without her presence to give it meaning. They were buried together in a small cemetery they had created on the mountain, surrounded by the graves of other women who had found refuge there over the years. Their headstone bore a simple inscription: "She stays with me forever." The mountain compound they had built became a memorial and museum, preserved by the state as a testament to their legacy. Visitors came from around the world to see where the legendary mountain woman had lived and worked, to understand how two people's love had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was not the museum or the historical markers or the books written about their lives. It was the law that still bore Carolyn's name, still protecting women from the kind of abuse she had endured. It was the women who continued to find courage in her example, who refused to accept less than they deserved because she had shown them it was possible to demand better. Most of all, it was the enduring truth that love, real love, was not about possession or control or the right to own another person's life and choices. It was about seeing someone's true worth, supporting their growth, and choosing every day to build something beautiful together. It was about the revolutionary idea that every person, regardless of gender or station in life, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Carolyn Robinson had learned this truth in a mountain cabin, taught by a gentle giant who saw her worth when she could not see it herself. Together, they had lived this truth, shared it with others, and left behind a legacy that would endure long after their names were forgotten. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.